So hello and welcome everyone. I'm delighted to introduce you to our Tuesday Spotlight of March 2024, Eclectic Elements of Egyptian Temples. And this is within our wider theme of Wonders of Egypt. So we'll be having similar topics around wonders in ancient or medieval Egypt throughout the beginning of 2024. So do check out our website for other upcoming events in this theme. But today we are delighted to have Accetta Crowe with us as our speaker. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Archaeology and Art History from the University of Virginia, a Master of Philosophy in Egyptology from the University of Cambridge, and a PhD in Archaeology, also from the University of Cambridge. Her dissertation was entitled Thresholds of the Gods, Doorways and Movement in New Kingdom Theban Temples, in which she explored the connection between the construction and decoration of doorways and their perceived and actual usage. Whilst doing her doctoral research, she spent much time in Luxor, documenting and studying the doorways in situ, as well as consulting with the missions working on the temples in order to better understand how modern reconstruction and interpretation has physically altered the ancient structures. In the field, she has worked with the Middle Kingdom Theban Project, the Amana Project, the New Kingdom Research Foundation, and the Deep History of the Asut Region Project with the British Museum. Kelly currently works at the British Museum, where she was project curator for the 2022 to 2023 Hieroglyphs Unlocking Ancient Egypt exhibition, and is currently developing Egyptian touring exhibitions. So we're very excited for her input on these temples and the features that are less seen by visitors. So thank you so much for joining us, Kelly. Over to you.
Great. Well, yes, thank you everyone for giving up your lunch, or I suppose you might be eating your lunch while you're listening. I hope you are. I had an early one. So some of you may have actually attended the course that I gave last autumn for the EES, which was on the history of ancient Egypt and 30 temples. And when Charlotte got in touch, she told me I wasn't allowed to do 30 for this one since it's only 30 minutes. So instead, I decided to focus a little bit on some of the features that I'm familiar with, because I've gone through many of the nooks and crannies in these temples, but some that visitors and scholars just walk straight past. They don't necessarily realize they're there, or they're features that they don't fully understand, and just kind of give us a hint of these lovely eclectic elements of Egyptian temples. You might tell I'm a big fan of alliteration there. So we're going to talk about 6 different things today. We're talking about Nilometers, hearing ear chapels, Assyrians, cachets or caches, sanatoriums, and crypts. So it'll be a bit of a whirlwind, and for each of these I'll try to give 1 or 2 examples so that if you do travel to Egypt and head into some of these temples, you can have a look for these great features and for other ones that are hidden kind of right in front of our eyes, or indeed beneath our feet. So I focus mostly in Upper Egypt because that's where I'm most familiar. As you heard from the little bio that Charlotte gave, I focus mostly in the Theban area, but Upper Egyptian temples are my most familiar area. And hopefully, if you are going to Egypt, you'll hit some of these places as well. So you'll be able to see the elements that we speak of. So going to dive right in because we only have 30 minutes. The first thing I want to talk about is Nilometers. So what exactly is a Nilometer? Well, it's a good question. It basically is a way to track the levels of the Nile flood. So for those of you familiar with ancient Egypt, you know that every year the Nile flooded. The rains that came from the source of the Nile down in Africa brought with it this rise in water that went towards the delta and basically rejuvenated the fields in the Egyptian Nile Valley. And this was very beneficial and gave rise to the Egyptian civilization. But knowing how these floods were going was very important. So if you had too little of a flood, you might have a famine. If you had too much, you might have too much flooding and you can't actually plant just enough. And well, of course, the king wants to be able to calculate how much taxes he's taking, since often he took taxes in grain. We have 3 types of these measuring of the Nile Nilometers. You have a staircase one, like you can kind of see in the background, a stepped well, and a shaft that often had a pillar in it. The shaft pillars tend to be a more modern version, so we won't talk about those, but we're going to talk just briefly about the other 2. These Nilometers measure the Nile flood in cubits. So that is the standard measurement of ancient Egypt. It was originally the length between your elbow and the tip of your middle finger, although not everybody's, obviously. It was standardized to about 52 centimeters at one point in Egyptian history. But interestingly, these Nilometers don't have a consistent 0 point, a consistent baseline. And that's because, of course, the Nile is narrower or wider at certain parts in the Nile Valley. And so the normal level of the Nile will vary depending on where the Nilometer is built. The oldest records that we have suggest that we had these measurements from the Old Kingdom, although the Nilometers themselves don't survive. The ones that we do have today tend to have been rebuilt in the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, and they were very popular then for measuring as well, and even into the Arabic and medieval periods. So the most famous ones are the Nilometers at Elephantine. So there's actually 2 on the island of Elephantine and 2 on the island of Philae, the original island, not the one the temple was moved to after the Aswan High Dam was built. And this is a very important place because to the ancient Egyptians, this was the border between Nubia and Egypt. It was the site of the first cataract, which is a series of rapids. And the Egyptians actually believed that the flood came forth from this area of the cataract. So it might be no surprise to you that there's significant ties to the inundation and that there were temples very early on in Egyptian history built here that had to do with gods and water and the Nile. The most famous one is at the Temple of Satet on Elephantine Island. And this is a very interesting reconstruction. You can see that the French created in the late 1800s. Here at the bottom, you can see the staircase that leads to the level of the Nile and the measuring holes up the sides, and then all the way up to the entrance where the temple complex would have been in ancient times. We know from a document called the Palermo Stone, which is one of our earliest political records in ancient Egypt, that in the Old Kingdom, so around 2500 BC, the ideal flood level would have been 7 cubits, but this increases by about 2000 BC up to 23 cubits. Why exactly this increases, whether we saw a kind of drying out of the Nile Valley and therefore the regular level of the Nile is down and you're required to have higher flood in order to have exactly the same amount of material brought, we're not entirely sure. But we know that the Palermo Stone records that in this area, the Nilometer needed to be up to 23 cubits, or excuse me, 7 cubits in the Old Kingdom, and then our later data tells us 23 cubits in the Middle Kingdom. So that's a big jump, but it just shows how detailed records were kept throughout ancient Egyptian history of this flooding of the Nile and just how important it was. You can see here the entrance, which is still visible today in the river. There are the stairs leading up to it. It took the flood waters 10 days to get from the first cataracts at Elephantine up to the Nile Delta. And so this gave us a good idea of what to expect, although obviously some of the water would evaporate, some of it would end up in the fields. Not everything, not the full volume would make it all the way up the Nile, but how to expect the crops would grow and the inundation would be whether successful or unsuccessful throughout the year. Now, these Nilometers continued to be used. You can see in this photograph on the right-hand side, if I can find my mouse, there it is. This Nilometer measurements in Arabic numerals, and that's because the Nilometer was rediscovered in the 1800s and then reused by the Egyptians living in the area in order to, again, measure the Nile. Now, of course, today, because of the Aswan High Dam, the Nile no longer floods. So you can go down to the bottom and see where this baseline is. And this is a nice view looking up, and you can see these spaced out measurement bars all the way up the side. Now, we don't just have these staircase Nilometers, we also have well Nilometers like this one. So this is at the Temple of Kamombo, a bit further north of the Nile, and you can see it looks just like a modern day well, circular in shape, and looking down inside the staircase where you could access the level of the water to take measurements. Now, you don't just jump off the top and hopefully land on the staircase on this one. There's actually, again, a more graduated slope with stairs inside. And if this works, hopefully it was, I did test it, we can see a 3D scan of this, which it will load hopefully in a moment. Yeah, there we go. And yeah, so you would enter here through this doorway, and then you would go down the stairs into the well to measure. And so, of course, if the water came up, it would also be able to come up the stairs, and you could measure it very similarly to the way that it was measured in Elephantine. Just close that before it causes my computer not to run smoothly. Now, Edfu has a stair and well Nilometer as well, just like the one in Kamombo, but this one was safely ensconced within the temple walls. So the other two were in temple enclosures, so in the large area outside of the temple itself. This one is actually between the inner wall of the temple building and the very tight enclosure wall, the front pylon of the temple being here, and you'd access it just through here. Now, because of the Nile moving, it's a moving river, it doesn't stay in one place all the time. We actually, when you walk out, you just walk out into nothing now. if you walk down the Edfu Nilometer, but having it tucked inside the temple meant that the priests could make notes about the level of the Nile night and day and keep an even more detailed record. Going to move on to our second element, and that is hearing ear chapels. So these are sometimes also called contra temples. You may have heard them termed that. And really, these were focuses of access to the divine for the ordinary person. So in ancient Egypt, unlike today, temples were not open to the public. Congregations did not gather there. It was exclusively for people who had been purified, priests who served in the temple, the king, etc. And so normal people couldn't access the divine in that way. A lot of people prayed in their own homes. They had shrines to household gods. But if they wanted to petition these larger state gods, they had to find an alternate way. And one of these was hearing ear chapels. These were built against the exterior wall of the temple, and people would leave votive offerings or prayers and petitions there. Sometimes there were even holes in the back of the walls of these hearing ear chapels where priests could listen in and then give responses. So oracular decisions, as in an oracle coming out on a decision for the question you'd asked. The most famous ones are located at Luxor and Karnak temples in Thebes. So Karnak being one of the largest temple complexes in the world today, they were both dedicated to the god Amun-Ra. And between these two temples, there were quite a few religious festivals that occurred where people could have access to the divine by watching them in procession, by watching the king do certain rituals along the processional route. So these hearing ear chapels made sense to be in this location. Oh, sorry, the color on this is some kind gone wonky. The two hearing ear chapels that have been identified at Karnak are at the rear of the temple. You can see them just up at the top, if I can get my mouse to cooperate, but there it goes. There are two just up here, and they are dated to the reigns of Thutmosis III and Ramses II, both in the New Kingdom. They're on the main axis of the temple, as you can see, straight up the middle, and they would have been, as I mentioned, accessible to the public because they're outside of the enclosure wall. This is a beautiful rendering by Jean-Claude Gauvin about what the Thutmosis III contra temple might have looked like. Here it is here. These two obelisks don't survive today, so if you've been, that's why it looks so different. But you can see here it's attached to the back wall. So you can't get inside from this, but you can come, and this is along the main axis leading to the sanctuary. There are two side chambers and one main central chamber in the Thutmosis III hearing ear chapel. And in the central chamber is actually a statue of the king embracing the god Amun-Ra. So they kind of serve as an intermediary, the statue, to the one that would be inside the main sanctuary. So you kind of petitioned the statue and it communicated the petition to the god himself. A little bit later, Ramses II built a new enclosure wall around the temple, a little bit wider, and he actually blocked off access to this Thutmosis III chapel. And so he had to build his own hearing ear temple. We call it the Eastern Temple. It's actually much larger, multi-chambered. It has a portico, so you can see the pillars in the front, which would have held up a roof. And as I mentioned, that was because of this new enclosure wall that he built. But it is in direct alignment with the Thutmosis shrine just behind it, although there would have been a wall there, so you wouldn't be able to see it the way you can see it now. And interestingly enough, this temple itself is actually named Ramses who hears prayers. So he is himself taking on the role of the god, which is not a surprise because anyone who knows a bit about Ramses II knows that he actually deified himself in life in a lot of his statuary. So he is taking on the role of Amun-Ra here and taking on the petitions of the people. Now, he also has a kind of hearing ear chapel in Luxor Temple. So this is in the open courtyard in the northernmost part of Luxor Temple. Ramses II reincorporated an earlier shrine that was built by Hatshepsut for the festival bark. So these are boats where the god statue was carried on top of priests' shoulders. And these boats would come in procession from Karnak to Luxor, be installed in this small chapel temporarily, and then go into the central sanctuary. And because this courtyard actually has an entrance to the main village or town of ancient Thebes on the east, it's been speculated by some scholars that people could actually come into this courtyard once all the sacred barks had moved into the temple itself and petition the god or observe some of the things, the prayers, the rites that were happening. And they often think that because of this is a false door at the back of this bark shrine. It's essentially, as it says in the name, a fake door. You can't go through it, but there's a matching one, or there used to be before Alexander the Great blew through the wall, in the sanctuary of Luxor Temple. So people think that scholars think the ordinary people may have come in here, prayed to this false door, and the message was taken through the false door in the sanctuary to the god to carry on those petitions, which is why Lanny Bell called them divinely appointed telephone booths, which is, I just love. I think that's a great way of thinking about it. We're then going to move a bit further north to Abydos to talk about the Assyrian and some other Assyrians that exist. So Assyrians are a cenotaph, or a fake tomb for the god Osiris. He's the god of the dead. And it is a structure which imitates both the myth of creation on one hand and the underworld on the other hand. They're often associated with tombs and funerary temples. There's a handful that we know in existence. I'll talk about a few others in a minute. But we know that they have this funerary role because they have inscriptions inside of them from the underworld books. So things like the Book of the Dead or the Book of Amduat, very similar to actual tombs. So these cenotaphs are fake tombs. No one's actually buried inside them necessarily, but they are very strikingly similar to real ones. The most famous one is at Abydos, as I mentioned, just a bit north of Thebes. And the temple itself that it's built in conjunction with is actually named the temple Seti the First is Osiris, or as Osiris. So he is taking on this role as the god of the dead, and it's a funerary temple for him. Now, Abydos itself was clearly associated with the legend and the mythology of Osiris. It was said to be the burial place of the god himself. And so it makes sense that Seti would be dedicating this fake tomb and his funerary temple to Osiris in Abydos. It's also still the location of modern pilgrimages. Many people go there because they believe there's ancient energy and magic in the earth that they can absorb. So people are still visiting this area because they believe it has this mythological power. The Assyrian is located behind the main temple. So you can see the main temple is a bit of an L shape here, but up along the main axis, and behind is the Assyrian. You can't actually get into it from the temple. It comes in from this tunnel. You can see that dog legs to the left, and then into a pillared chamber. This is very similar to tombs at the time that were being built, same kind of structure, just a bit larger. But that's where this has come from. It's based on the style of a New Kingdom tomb. Here's a suggested reconstruction. It includes a mound, a roof. So unlike today where we can look straight into it, it would have been completely covered on the top. And on top of that mound, people have speculated that there were perhaps trees planted. And this is because the story of creation says that from the watery nothingness, a mound emerged, and on that mound bloomed a flower, and from the flower came the first gods and all life. So this is imitating that story of creation, which of course is about renewal and eternal rebirth. And so every pharaoh wants that to happen to him in the afterlife. We also see this idea of a mound kind of replicated inside, where you have this square platform with water that would be all around it. And of course, it's underground. So again, we're talking about the underworld and Osiris. So all sorts of iconography and metaphors going on in this architecture. It was discovered in the early 1900s. Here's a great picture from the Egypt Exploration Society of the early excavation. Right in the foreground here, you can see the tunnel that I mentioned, and dog legs to the left there as you come down. And it took quite a few years to excavate it. And it is purposely sunk below the water table to give this idea of emerging from the watery nothingness of creation. So what is really fantastic is that sometimes during heavy flooding, we get a lot of water, or when the water table is high. Now, of course, as I mentioned, the Nile doesn't flood anymore, so it really depends seasonally. But other years, that central structure emerges and you can see it more clearly. And then other times, even, so this is 1925, you can go quite a far bit down where the water table is sunk almost entirely, and you don't have any water around that central platform at all. The decoration inside doesn't actually date to Seti I. So the construction does. We know that because we found his name on some tenons that go between the stones. So these are little wooden blocks that help secure the stones next to each other. But the decoration dates from his grandson, Merenptah, and it shows these funerary books for his grandfather, Seti I. And as I mentioned, this decoration and construction is very similar to tombs in the Valley of the Kings done by the royals at this time. But this isn't the only Assyrian that's ever been discovered. There's other ones that tend to be associated specifically with tombs. So there was one very recently, within the last 10 years, discovered in Sheikh Abdel Qurna. This is in Luxor on the West Bank. And it was underground, but there's a mound, if you like, a raised room with a tunnel all around. So to kind of isolate it as if it's this island. And in it, just at the back, you might be able to see there's a statue of Osiris there coming out of the wall. And in front, a shaft. And when you go down the shaft, so here's the statue again, just there at the back. You come down the shaft, it leads to four burial chambers. So whoever's being buried here is being very intimately associated with Osiris and with this idea of regeneration and eternal life, etc. And so it was quite a significant piece of decoration to have in their tomb. This is much later, several hundred years later in the late period, not the same date as the Seti I Assyrian at Abydos. But there is another structure at Giza that's quite similar to this as well, which the dating is perhaps a little bit closer to the Assyrian at Abydos itself. So this is in a tomb, a large deep shaft tomb, as you can see again here, running beneath the causeway of Khafre. So that's the center pyramid, and it's not underneath in a sense of hidden underneath, it's underneath as a sense of carved through at a later date. And I have to read you Zahi Hawas's quote that he gives when he wrote this article. He excavated in the late 1990s, and he said a little bit of history about the shaft. He said, in 1945, Abdelmoniam Abu Bakr learned that guides at Giza were swimming in and drinking from the water of an underground shaft. He discovered it and its attendant chambers under the causeway of Khafre, but he never excavated or published it, and the rising water table prevented scholars from studying it further. However, workmen responsible for the rest house of Cairo University, located south of the causeway and in the shadow of the pyramid, continued to use the shaft as a water source by running the pipeline from the shaft to the rest house and as a summer swimming hole for the guides on the Giza Plateau. So I think that's absolutely amazing that the water had come up so high that people were swimming and drinking out of this. Unlike the water in the Assyrian, which was quite green, as you notice, because it's very stagnant, this is rising and sinking through the nice limestone, essentially aquifer that is the Giza Plateau. And so therefore the water was a little bit clearer and better to drink from. Gosh, I hope so. If people are going to be doing that quite consistently. We can see here on the bottom, we have a similar idea of this mounds that's arising and these deep, there's actually four of them. This is in cross section, these deep kind of shafts down where the water would come up. And here's a picture of Zahi. So in the center, you actually have a sarcophagus. It's empty. And then around the edges would have been where the water came from. And he estimates, based on some of the ceramics that are found, that it was actually originally excavated in the New Kingdom, so around the same time as the Assyrian at Abydos. And this makes sense because around that same period, the necropolis in Giza was known as the necropolis of Rosetchau, which is the necropolis in the underworld in which Osiris is ruling. So he's saying that at this time period, people were thinking of Giza as the necropolis of Osiris, and therefore having an Osiris tomb or an Assyrian in this area makes perfect sense. And then later on, some more intrusive burials from the late period. So again, this idea that we're seeing New Kingdom late period idea of Assyrians being very popular. We're then going to move on back into the temples, away from the tombs, to talk about cachets. So cachets are, for want of a better definition, a sacred rubbish dump. So these are massive holes or pits, often located in temple courtyard, where we find statuary dumped into these pits. And this is because there's lots and lots of statues dedicated in an Egyptian temple. You, of course, have statues of the gods, but you also have statues dedicated by the king. And you'll have statues dedicated by priests and other nobles who want to take advantage of the daily cult of the god and hope that that will grant them some help in perpetuity for their afterlife, of course, and for their daily life, because they dedicate them while they're still alive. Now, as you might imagine, if people are constantly dedicating statues, temples can get rather full. And so you need some place to put these statues, but you can't just throw them away because they're consecrated. So they need to be buried in consecrated ground, hence these statue cachets located in temple courtyards. Now, these are hugely beneficial for Egyptologists, as it kind of fills in the blank for us about who's using the temples, what people's jobs are. People often put their parentage or their children on the inscription, so we can form entire family groups of priests and other nobles, which is quite beneficial for our research. The most famous one is the Karnak cachet. So it was originally discovered in the 7th pylon court. This is what the 7th pylon court looks like today, with the very characteristic royal statues. And here it is in 1903. So in 1903, Legrand, who was doing some excavations in the Accetta Court, came across a very thin layer of clean, pure sand, and underneath a statue of a king. And he thought, oh, that's interesting. So he dug down to free the statue, and he found a second one, and another one, and kept going until they were over 17 meters down and still finding statues. So this is an absolutely enormous pit, as you can see here from all the workmen working in it. It was also very wet. So they had to get a pipe. You can see it along the right-hand side of the image, and pumps to pump the water out. And there's actually documentation of workmen fishing for statues to get them out of the mud, which is quite incredible. And up along the back, you can see there the characteristic statues from the 7th pylon. So as you walk across this court, just think about all the things that were under your feet that we didn't even know about prior to 1903. Now, the cachet itself was incredible. It had over 800 statues, 17,000 bronze figures, and hundreds of other votive objects dedicated by people, mostly given by priests and other elites. And today, most of these statues are located in the Cairo Museum. The excavator did give some away to patrons and friends. Some went on walkabout, as you might imagine, when so many things are coming out of the ground and so many people involved. Some things didn't always stay on site, but even more were actually sold by the Cairo Museum. So early on in the 1900s, the Cairo Museum had a gift shop where you could buy antiquities that they thought they had enough examples of already. So that was quite interesting. So that explains why, if you've ever seen something in a museum near you from the Karnak cachet, that's probably how it got there. Now, there's an entire website giving a catalog of all these with the original excavator's numbers, and you'll notice that many of them are still unpublished. So if you're itching for something to translate and study, you might find one of these waiting for you there. It's not the only cache, though, in Luxor, in the town of Luxor. Luxor Temple, which I mentioned as being south of Karnak, also had one in the open-air solar court that was built by Amenhotep III. You can see a beautiful picture of it here. And this was very recent. This was only discovered in 1989. And I know to some of you that's probably not that recent, but showing my age there. That this is a really phenomenal discovery. It was only 26 statues, so much fewer than at Karnak, and they were purely royal and divine, so we didn't have any private statues here. And the theory is that these were buried during the Roman takeover of Luxor Temple. So at some point in time, Luxor Temple became a garrison fortress for the Romans stationed in Luxor, and perhaps they decided they needed a sacred space for something, for troops, for stable, etc. And the priest said, no, you can't just throw away the statues. So they were buried in the solar court, only for us to discover many years later. And you can see some pictures here of them uncovering them in the late 80s. Today, many of these statues are on display in Luxor Museum. So if you have an opportunity, when you go in, there's a downstairs gallery. That's where this photo is from. It's really, really beautiful. The statues are in stunningly good condition, which is because, of course, I mentioned they were just moving them. They weren't destroying them, and they had to be buried in consecrated ground. So if you do get an opportunity when you're at Luxor to go to the museum, definitely take a look at this gallery. Absolutely beautiful examples of the type of statuary that would have been in the temples. However, not all the statuary that ended up in caches was treated so well. We have caches from Nubia, where we have a very unique situation. So there are 3 of them that we know so far: Gebel Barkal, Dokigel, and Dengel. These were purposely hacked off. So their heads were cut off, their arms were cut off, their legs were cut off at the knees, and then they were very carefully buried respectfully in pits. So is this the same people doing the hacking as doing the burying? Seems unlikely. Some theories have been put forward that this is a period of time where kings from Egypt were at war with kings from Nubia, and so perhaps this was some sort of battle remnant. However, the dating of the Dengel one seems a little late for this, plus Dengel is quite far south for that to happen. So this might be another incidents that we don't really understand the purpose of happening uniquely in Nubian temples. So this is still being studied today, and hopefully soon we'll find out some more information about these absolutely gorgeous statues that were created. Moving on to our next element, and this is sanatoriums. So this is something that you may not be so familiar with if you're not a specialist in the later periods of ancient Egypt and Ptolemaic and Roman periods. but this has to do with medicine, magic, and the divine. So sanatoriums are essentially spaces within the temple, or sometimes special structures built in temple complexes that served as a type of medical center. Now, a lot of priests were trained with sacred scripts that were kept in the temple library, and these scripts had medical advice as well as magical advice, as well as sacred rituals for the temple. So it made sense that this would be a place where you would come if you needed help with fertility or health. Now, we wonder whether these sanatoriums might have earlier origins, but we're not entirely sure. The structures definitely seem to be dating from the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. The most famous one is at Deir al-Bahri, so this is on the west bank. It's originally the temple of Hatshepsut, but at a later date, it was taken over, the top terrace especially, and it became dedicated to Amenhotep, son of Hapu, and Imhotep. And these were men who had lived 1,000 years before, but had been deified. So they'd been turned into gods for their great accomplishments, and they were legendary and associated with the medical arts. And later on, this terrace actually became a Coptic monastery, so it really never stopped being sacred throughout Egyptian history. Specifically, the Amun Chapel and the royal cult rooms, I'll show you a bit of a plan in a second, those were the ones turned into this sanatorium. And here people practiced the tradition of incubation. So this means that you go and you sleep inside the temple, and you hope to have a dream or have a healing moment that the god will come to you and heal you, or tell you information in a dream about a question that you have about your health or your family, etc. And the priests, who I said had access to these sacred texts stored in the temple libraries, would then interpret them for you and give you the god's decision or give you advice on what you should do. And we know lots and lots of people came here to do this because we have hundreds of the graffiti and ostraca left behind in the temple. So you can see here on the left, these are the royal cult chambers and some of the graffiti here. And these are actually the original sanctuary of Amun with this beautiful kind of pillared wall built outside in the Ptolemaic and Roman period. And some of them are just names, but some of them say specific things. So there's one left from the Ptolemaic period, which says, "Please remember us and grant us healing," with a joint aid, and that lists a few gods. But then there's also a later Christian one in this same graffiti that says, "There's only one God who helps us." So interesting that there's kind of this continued use and back and forth about what could be done in incubation, in healing through this temple. Now, the reason we think that this might have been an earlier trend is because we have dream book papyri from the New Kingdom. And this is 1,000 years earlier. And these dream book papyri, this is one in the British Museum, are very formulaic, but very interesting. And this would have been the type of text that was stored in the temple library and consulted by priests. So in this case, it's quite formulaic. It says, if a man sees himself in a dream, then it tells you what you see, and then it says whether it's good or bad, and then it tells you what that means. So for instance, if a man sees himself in a dream herding monkeys, this is bad, it means a change is coming. If a man sees himself in a dream and his bed is on fire, this is bad, it means his wife is going to leave him. Now, there are also good ones, it's not just all bad ones, but it's very interesting to see what these kind of oracular meanings would have been for dreams. And of course, there are also medical texts that we know the priests could have consulted as well. Now, it's not just at Deir al-Bahri that we see this incubation. We also see it up north in Saqqara. So this is near Giza, near the pyramids. And there are several animal temples here. And one is called the Anubian. This is for the temple to Anubis, the jackal god. And there's actually what they call Bes chambers here. So these are the same. They're used for incubation, but they're dedicated to the god Bes. You can see him here. He's a dwarf god, especially protective of children, helpful with fertility. And in fact, we find lots and lots of votive offerings brought by petitioners, which are men, teeny tiny men, very, very large phalluses. So clearly fertility is something that people are concerned of here. And it's not just men coming here, women would be coming here to sleep as well. So this is just a trend that's helping for the family, for anything that's having issues with your health and your fertility in this case. The final element I want to look at, which is good because I know we're getting on with time a bit, is crypts. So I'm going to cut you off here for all of you who are like, ooh, creepy dead people. That's not the type of crypt I mean, unfortunately. This type of crypt was used for storage. So especially in Roman and Ptolemaic temples, we see this beneath the floor. This would have been areas of storage for pieces of cult material. So things like emblems and standards that you would carry in procession, statues, especially statues of gods that were visiting the temple, so not statues of the god whose temple it was there, and other kinds of cult equipment, incense burners, etc. It's not treasure in the sense that stacks of gold and silver coins, but it is treasure in the sense that a lot of these would be made out of very valuable materials, gold, silver, ivory, etc. Earlier versions of these crypts were just storerooms. Karnak has a whole bunch of them around the Middle Kingdom court. Ground level rooms would have been used to store the cultic equipment, but for whatever reason, in these later temples, they put them underneath. The most famous are the crypts at Dendera. That is just north of Thebes as well. And this is the Temple of Hathor. The temple itself that you see today was starting in the Ptolemaic period, but although there was a temple on that site since the Old Kingdom. It's most famous for the Dendera Zodiac, which is now in the Louvre, as well as its gorgeous blue ceilings that show all sorts of astrological scenes. The library, as I mentioned, the temples have libraries, this one with a list of books that would have been inside, its roof terraces and lots of other things at Dendera. Now, Dendera is unique. It has crypts beneath the floor and in the walls, which is quite interesting. And having just been there in January, I can tell you can now buy a ticket to see 3 of those crypts. So if you are going to Dendera, definitely take advantage of that. It's really lovely to be able to see them in person. So here's the cross section. This is looking south towards the sanctuary. You can see in the center, and you can see up the walls. There's some below the floor and some up in the walls. So this is the east and west walls. Now, the ones you can see today are in the south. Here's a cross section. And I'll talk about the 3 of the ones that are open. So the bottom one is arguably the most famous, this Southern Crypt 1. It's not defaced, which is really quite incredible. So a lot of the reliefs, in the temple were hacked out in later periods. This idea of iconoclasm, not wanting these ancient icons to be prevalent, but these crypts were missed a lot of the times. So you have some really gorgeous raised relief down here. It's a very narrow chamber accessed by a very small staircase through the floor of Chapel L. And it contains one of the most famous reliefs in Dendera, and that's the light bulb relief. People call it a light bulb relief. It's not actually a light bulb. It's actually the snake of creation inside the mound of creation, which is coming out of the flower, which is coming out of the waters of Nun. But I can see why people think it's a light bulb, and certainly quite a fun one with the little jud pillar with arms holding it up here. The second crypt is actually up in the wall. You have to climb a ladder to get into it. And it's also extremely narrow, as you can see. What they were storing in here, I'm not entirely sure. You'd have to climb over it to get to half of it. But along the walls, you actually have the ancestors of the temple, and at the back, a totem of Hathor, very similar to the Hathor pillars, long column, head of Hathor with the abbreviation of a chapel on her head. And this is really, really beautiful. Again, you can see it hasn't been defaced because it was missed high up in the wall. Hard to get to. Very hard to get to. So this is a picture of me, very flattering. Getting in, you climb up the ladder, you kind of have to go through this very small hole in order to get in. And the final one is on the main axis. This is more of a niche than an actual kind of crypt, if you like. It's not really that large. It's kind of one very small room about the size of a small closet. Much easier to get to, nice ladder, human-sized doorway. And because it was more obvious, it's hard to see in this picture, but there's actually a designation for the door lintel up top. It probably was found because we do see some damage. You can see the pitting along the goddess figures here on the side inside. And this is also a great example of one of the other interesting things at Dendera, which is the blank cartouche. So you can see here, there's no king's names inside the cartouches. People have speculated perhaps it was because the king died before it was filled in, but in most cases, then the following king would fill it in. In this case, we think it's probably to represent all kings. So it's kind of in perpetuity, any king it would then apply to by having the symbol of the cartouche without the name filled in. So that is a very, very quick run through 6 of some of the eclectic elements of Egyptian temples that I love to see. Hopefully now that I've pointed them out to you, when you visit Egyptian temples, you'll also be able to find them yourself, or at least know where they would have been. Obviously, I don't encourage you to dig through the ground of the 7th pylon court at Karnak. But there are lots of other things as well. Obviously, I couldn't get to everything. A lot of things that are hiding around the temple. So if you're going to take a visit, have a read of some of these temples and go off the beaten path, see what else there is to find. This is the roof terrace at Dendera, and you can see the gods going up the stairs. So this was the original stairs to the top of the roof. And here the gods are going up to participate in the festival where their souls are rejuvenated by the statue being exposed to the sunlight. So all these hidden gems are wonderful things to keep an eye out from. But I hope I've given you a taste for some of these eclectic elements. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kelly. What a fascinating lecture. And thank you so much for introducing these features that are maybe not quite so recognized by most of us in Egyptian temples, but provide such a wealth of knowledge. And yes, hopefully our audience has an idea of what things to go to when they next visit Egypt. Thank you so much again, Kelly, for a brilliant lecture. Everyone live in the Zoom room has said thank you and how interesting it has been. And I'd just like to read out one of our comments, the next best thing to actually being there. So yes, I think it's been a brilliant sort of virtual exploration of Egyptian temples today. So thank you very much. And I just have to point out for those of you joining us, it is renewal season at the EES. So if you have not yet renewed your membership for 2024 into 2025, memberships running till the end of March next year, please do visit our website to do that. And if you're not yet a member, what are you waiting for? Please do join us. And of course, this event was free, and membership and donations are the only ways we can provide these lectures and other exciting information for you. So please do consider supporting the society and joining our great community. And thank you all for joining us either live in the Zoom room or catching up on YouTube. So thank you so much, Kelly. Any final words before we close today?
But I guess just when you do go to Egypt, if you get there, keep an eye out. And if you see any elements that you have a question with, then come on back and I'll be happy to answer some questions.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for that offer, Kelly. And we hope to see you again soon, either in a temple or at an EES event. So thank you all. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.